A common myth about the chromatic button accordion is that the note locations are based on some complex design principle. When you research this subject, you tend to hear about how the buttons are arranged such that when you go from button to button in different directions, you get certain note intervals, as in this diagram from a popular online article. I've heard some chromatic accordionists explain that the keyboard is designed such that notes along each row are in minor thirds. Well, although these technical details are true, it turns out that they are not really the underlying principle upon which the chromatic button system was designed. Nor is it necessary to know these technical details in order to play the instrument. I've been playing for several years, and I can't even tell you off the top of my head such technical details. In reality, the principle upon which the keyboard is designed is much more fundamental and much simpler than that. Let me introduce this subject by first talking about the piano accordion keyboard. If I were to ask you what fundamental design principle was used to define the location of treble notes on the piano accordion keyboard, you would probably respond by saying something like this. Simple. The notes are arranged sequentially in increasing order of pitch from left to right. Or as you see me holding the instrument like this, downwards towards the floor. Low notes are up here at this end. High notes down here at this end. Every note is located in increasing order of pitch. And of course, that would be a correct answer. But perhaps a more accurate answer is in increasing order of pitch chromatically from left to right. This second answer ensures that you include the presence of the black keys, the sharps and flats. And since the black keys are made smaller and located forward relative to the white keys, it's possible to view the piano keyboard as consisting of two rows of keys, the natural notes on the first row and the sharps and flats on the second row. The proper order of pitch between the white and black keys is preserved by placing each black key between its two chromatically adjacent white keys. That was one octave of the chromatic scale consisting of 12 notes played from left to right in increasing order of pitch, starting at C and ending with an additional 13th note, a repeat of the note C, this time in the next octave. For those who desire more technical definitions, in this scale each note is separated by what we call in music theory a half step. Well, it turns out that the notes on the chromatic button keyboard are also arranged in increasing order of pitch from left to right, or as you see me here holding the instrument, downwards towards the floor. Low notes are up here at this end. High notes down here at this end. However, this time we do not reserve separate rows to be exclusively for the naturals or the sharps and flats, as on the piano. In this system, we treat all notes, the naturals and the sharps and flats, equally, and we allocate them one at a time amongst 3 rows sequentially in increasing order of pitch. The particular rows to which the notes are allocated are those that in my first video in this series I called the basic instrument. Counting from the outside edge, row 1, row 2, and row 3. If you have previously viewed another video in Roxy's official YouTube channel called Piano Accordionist Learns Chromatic, then you already know that there exists more than one chromatic system. Let me present first the C-Griff system, the one you see here, the one that is most popular in Western Europe, and the one that I play. I'll discuss the other popular chromatic system called V-Griff or Russian Bayan in another video. Before I start, notice that corresponding button positions on each roll are not set directly above each other. They are offset. You see, this button on the second roll is not located above a button on the first roll. Instead, it is located directly above the space between these two buttons. The result is, in order to move from a particular button position in one roll to the same button position in the next, I must follow a diagonal that leans towards the right. Having to follow a diagonal to go to corresponding button positions from row to row is not something that you're unfamiliar with. This is in fact no different from the buttons on your Stradella bass system. You can see that this button on the second row is located in the space between these two buttons on the first row. The result is that to go from a particular button in one row to the same button position in the next row, I must follow a diagonal. A diagonal that, when viewed as you see here, leans towards the right. Note that in the bass system, by convention, row 1 is closest to the bellows, and row 6 is at the outside edge of the instrument. In contrast, on the chromatic button keyboard, by convention, row 1 is closest to the outside edge of the instrument, and row 3 is closer to the bellows. So, following a diagonal that leans to the right, these three buttons represent equivalent locations in the first three rows. As you will soon realize, the direction of the diagonal, leaning towards the right, suggests increasing pitch as I move from row 1 to row 3. Once I reach the third row, I must return to the first row, at which point I can start on and follow the next adjacent diagonal to the right. If I want to go further than that, I must once again jump back down to the first row to start the next diagonal to the right, and so on for the entire keyboard. For now, forget about the fourth and fifth rows. As I said in my first video in this series, the fourth and fifth rows are not really part of the official basic chromatic button system. Rather, they are an extension of the chromatic system, an extension that is provided to support certain playing conveniences. That is a whole other subject. I can now show you the locations of notes for the same chromatic scale that I played earlier on the piano accordion. I start with the natural note C on the first row. Notice that it is a white button, just like the corresponding white key for the note C on the piano keyboard. So where's the next note? I move to the button at the same position in the next row, the second row, which I do by following the diagonal that leans towards the right. And look, it's a black button, just like the black key representing the next chromatic note above C on the piano keyboard. C sharp. How about that? The next note in increasing order of pitch is the note D. I follow the diagonal from the second to the third row, and presto, I arrive at a white button. It's D. It corresponds to the white key D on the piano keyboard. But now, because I'm on the third row, to progress further, I must jump back to the first row. And what do I find? A black button representing the note D sharp. Are you getting the idea? here are the notes representing the same chromatic scale that I played previously on the piano keyboard. So you see, the underlying design of the chromatic keyboard is not complex at all. Note locations are defined sequentially in increasing order of chromatic pitch along diagonals to equivalent locations from row 1 to row 3, and in adjacent diagonals from left to right, or as you see me playing the instrument, downwards towards the floor. It's an easy to understand system of sequential notes in ascending order. For those who prefer more technical definitions, as in the case of the piano keyboard, each chromatic note is separated by what we call in music theory a half step. The reality is, at their most basic level, the note layouts of the chromatic button keyboard and the piano keyboard are not very different at all. In each system, notes are located sequentially in increasing order of chromatic pitch, in half steps if you will, in a logical manner from left to right. But doesn't allocating the notes amongst 3 rows along adjacent diagonals and treating the natural notes and sharps and flats on an equal basis, as I've described, mean that the natural notes will be all mixed up amongst the sharps and flats, rather than in a nice straight line separated from the sharps and flats, easy to recognize, as they are here on the piano accordion. So, won't it be more difficult on the chromatic to figure out where the notes are, and more difficult to finger scales and melodies? Wait a minute. The advantage of the notes on the piano being in an easy to recognize straight line exists only if you play in the key of C, or A minor, the relative minor key to C major. In any other key signature, you must make use of the block keys, and their use will be different for each and every key signature, and as a consequence, the fingering of scales and melodies will be different for each and every key signature. Isn't that an important factor in determining the ease or difficulty of learning the piano system? It seems to me, before making claims that one style of instrument, either piano or chromatic, is easier to learn than the other, one should look at the total picture and consider what's required to play in different key signatures on both instruments. I do agree that the location of the natural notes on the chromatic button accordion looks confusing initially to someone who is unfamiliar with it. And I agree that learning the location of the natural notes requires an initial extra effort compared to the piano keyboard. But how difficult is it really? Here's a diagram from the very beginning of a lesson book showing the locations of the first 5 natural notes C to G and their corresponding fingering on both the piano and the chromatic. It turns out, with minimal practice on beginner level exercises, the location of the natural notes on the chromatic will soon seem perfectly natural. The fact is, on many musical instruments, like guitar or violin, the natural notes are not located along a single straight line. And yet people seem to manage to learn to play those instruments. But more importantly, because of some inherent characteristics of the chromatic button system, once these note locations are learned, the playing of scales and melodies in other key signatures becomes simplified. So, perhaps a good way for me to help you assess the difference in difficulty between playing each style of instrument, either piano or chromatic, is to first play a scale and a simple, very short beginner-level melody line on each instrument in the key of C, and then play the scale and the same melody line on each instrument in another key signature. To allow me to speak while simultaneously playing notes, it is advantageous for me to use the FR1X's piano sound. Here is the usual fingering taught in beginner-level lesson books to play the scale in C major. I play C, D, E using fingers 1 through 3. And then I bring the thumb, which technically is called finger number 1, under finger number 3, which is currently pressing on the E, to land on F. With the thumb on F, I can now easily complete the scale. Essentially, to allow me to complete the 8-note scale with the human limitation of only 5 fingers, I perform a thumb under operation after playing the E. If I want to continue into the next octave, I do another thumb under operation, this time under the 4th finger as it plays the 7th note of the scale, B, like this. Easy, isn't it? Of course, I have no difficulty finding the notes. All the required notes for playing this scale are laid out in proper order side by side right in front of me. I don't need any special training to learn the location of the notes. And now a few notes from a beginner level practice piece called Lightly Roll. I'd like to point out that the entire piece, which remains within a 5-note range, can be played while keeping all the fingers stationary over the same keys. It's all within the capabilities of a beginner-level music student. Okay then, how do I accomplish the same thing on the chromatic button keyboard? Well, obviously, because the natural notes are not in line on one row as on the piano. In the beginning, I had to first spend some time learning their locations, which I did by looking at diagrams as well as playing progressive practice pieces in the Mulgane book to expand my skill over the required tonal range. Having accomplished that, I can use the fingering that is advised in the Mulgane book for playing the scale in C. I play the notes C through G using fingers 1 through 5. Next, I bring the thumb under the 5th finger, which is currently pressing the G, over to the A button on the first row. From there, I can easily play the B followed by C. So you see, I use the very same thumb under operation as I did on the piano keyboard, except this time on a different note, on G instead of E. And in a manner similar to the piano, if I want to continue playing the scale into the next octave, I perform another thumb under operation after playing the 7th note, like this. And now a few notes of Lightly Roll. Well, I suspect that most people at this point would conclude that the piano accordion is easier to learn and play than the chromatic, for the reason that on the chromatic, the location of notes is not immediately obvious. Why bother learning the location of notes for playing in the key of C on the 3 rows of the chromatic when those same notes are so immediately apparent on the piano, all in sequential order, side by side, in a nice single roll, right? But what about playing in another key signature? For the sake of demonstration, I will choose as an example playing in the key of E flat, which contains 3 flats, E, A, and B. E flat is a very commonly used key signature. I've seen lots of sheet music written in it. No matter which instrument I use, for me to play from such sheet music, I need to feel comfortable with the location of notes in that key signature. On which instrument will it be easier to play? First, let me play on the piano accordion. The challenge of playing the scale in the key of E flat begins immediately with the first note of the scale, the tonic. Look, it's a black key. With the black keys set forward as they are, it is impractical for me to use the thumb for the tonic, as I did in the key of C. So, following the advice that most teachers give, to learn the correct fingering, I referred to this famous guidebook from Alfred on scales and arpeggios. I was told that I can start by using either the number 2 or number 3 finger to play the tonic. To play the next note F, I must do a thumb under operation. From there, I can progress using the fingers in order, but of course remembering that I must not play the A or B naturals. I must instead play A flat and B flat. And now, in order to complete the scale, I must do another thumb under operation to play C, followed by D and E flat. I'm left with the number 3 finger on E flat, from which I could go into the next octave with a thumb under operation, except that on this particular instrument I do not have sufficient tonal range. Of course, if you have already mastered the piano keyboard, you can already do all of this. But consider how beginner-level students would view this. No longer are the notes neatly arranged in order, side by side. The student not only requires special instruction on the locations of notes in this particular scale, but additional instruction on how to finger them. I suspect they would find the playing of the scale in E-flat major on the piano to be way beyond their capabilities. And what about the practice piece lightly roll? I can no longer play the piece keeping each finger stationary over each note. Now I must do some thumb under gymnastics in the middle of the melody. And did you notice how at the end I must use a different finger on the G than at the beginning? In the beginning, I used the number 2 finger on the G as the Alfred Scalebook recommends. But at the end, the number 2 finger is busy on the E flat, requiring me to play the next note in the melody line, G, using another finger. In the end, what was so easy to do in the key of C is obviously more difficult to accomplish in E flat. After mastering the scale in C, to play the scale in E flat on the chromatic requires only knowing the location of the starting note, the tonic of the scale, E flat, which anyone who understands the sequential allocation of notes on the instrument can easily figure out. It's right here on the first row, immediately to the right of C. From that new location, using the very same fingering as I used for the scale in C, I can play the scale in E flat. It's not necessary for me to keep in mind that the notes E, A, and B need to be played flat. My fingers automatically fall on the proper black buttons at the appropriate times. Any beginner-level student who has just mastered the scale in C can immediately, without further instruction, play the scale in E flat. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that students no longer need to learn the music theory behind the different key signatures. Of course, they should eventually learn all of that, but in due time. What I am demonstrating is that whereas on the piano, playing in the key of E flat was completely beyond the abilities of a beginner student, on the chromatic, it's easy. And what about the practice piece, Lightly Raw? Again, it can be played in the key of E flat using exactly the same fingering as was used in the key of C. As before, each finger remains stationary over one button throughout the entire piece. No finger gymnastics is required, as on the piano keyboard. In light of this demonstration, what do you now think about the relative ease or difficulty of learning the chromatic versus the piano style of accordion? It seems clear that if one restricts their playing to the key of C, then the piano accordion is easier because the location of the natural notes is so obvious. However, things change when one tries to play in different key signatures. Some key signatures, like G for example, are easier because it contains only one sharp and because the fingering is very similar to that used in the key of C. Other key signatures, like D flat and F sharp, are quite challenging. In contrast, on the chromatic, although the locations of the natural notes require more of a learning effort in the very beginning, the effort is much less than having to learn all the different note locations and fingerings of all 12 major scales on the piano. On the chromatic, playing music in different key signatures is remarkably easier. But let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that the chromatic is a better instrument than the piano accordion. I view them as different instruments, similar in many ways, but different in others. There are many reasons for choosing one over the other. Both are within the capacity of the average person to learn, and as proven by many virtuoso accordionists, each can be used to play the most advanced level music. But I am making the point that the popular opinion that compared to the piano accordion, the chromatic is a more complex instrument and hence more difficult to learn to play is a myth. As I showed in the beginning of this video, the allocation of notes to the chromatic keyboard is in a sequential manner very similar to the piano accordion. True, if you always play in the key of C, the piano is the easier instrument to learn and play. But when you consider the entire picture of playing music in all key signatures, the chromatic is definitely the easier one. In my next video in this series, I will present the other popular chromatic system called B-Griff or Russian Bayan. You will see that both the C-Griff and B-Griff are really manifestations of the same system. Stay tuned!